Welcome everybody to our 11th class on the book of Esther. I really enjoyed that idea from Yoram Chazoni last week, which is good because we're continuing it this week. We have more to say about it, but just a quick review. Hopefully everybody has the source sheet. I think so. Okay. It looks like everybody here is on the email list. So last week, in the beginning of chapter 4, Perek Daled, we talked about Esther's refusal to go to Achashverosh, her initial statement that she's not going, and no one gets to go in, and all of that. And we asked, wouldn't most people, we would think, we would hope, put the survival of their nation ahead of themselves? So we gave two sort of straightforward, practical approaches, in which Rashi said she's saying I can go later if it turns out that the threat is real, because right now it's 11 months away. Malbim saying Achashverosh is going to call me soon. It's been 30 days. We gave the Shlal David, Rabbi David Zinsheim, saying that she believes that the sin of the Jews has been atoned for, and therefore the whole decree is going to go away. But then we gave Yoram Chazoni's idea from the dawn, which is such a fascinating idea. And again, whether he's right or not, I can't say, but it's a strong idea regardless, and something very much worth thinking about. And that was the thought that people who become sort of the court Jew, people who become close to the throne, feeling that God has put them there in order to be able to accomplish a role, might end up in a position where they tell themselves, I need to accomplish this role, God needs me here, and being in that role becomes the dominant concern for them. It's most important that I retain this role, and I can't do anything to endanger it, and the result is they could actually end up failing in their mission because they took their eye off the ball. They became more concerned about being close to the throne than about doing what they're supposed to do. Right? Everyone remembers that idea from last week. He gave the example of Yosef, who a dozen years after the famine is over, is still telling his brothers, don't worry, I'm going to support everybody. Like, who are you supporting? Why are you supporting? Why are you still living in Egypt? That was the idea that the Chazoni presented, and he suggested that Esther has this overpowering sense of destiny that at first keeps her from going to Achashverosh. Well, that brings us to the second half of his idea, which is, so how does Mordechai convince Esther to go to Achashverosh? So if you take a look at Perek Daled, right, chapter 4, Psukim Yud Gimel and Yud Daled, sentences 13 and 14, look at what Mordechai says to Esther, or technically says to bring back to Esther, right? This is all through intermediary. Mordechai still wearing the sackcloth and ashes, which we have to come back to a little bit later. So he says, Al tidami v'nafshech lihimaleit beis hamelach mikol hayehudim. Don't imagine for yourself that you are going to run away to the palace, fleeing from all of the Jews. Ki em hacharesh tacharishi ba'ez hazos. If you're mute, now, revach v'hatzala ya'amod laYehudim mimakom acher. The Jews are going to get saved. The Jews are going to be fine. Something else is going to happen to save them. Ve'at uveisavich tovedu. You, your father's house, you'll be lost. Umi yodeim le'es kazos higat lamalchus, and who knows if this isn't the time for which you became queen. Maybe that's why you're here. What should bother us in Mordechai's sales pitch? I mentioned one point last time.
It's funny that it bothers you, because I've always found it to be very powerful. I have to say, it's like who are you to think that, number one, that you're not part of this whole decree, and it's really a rallying cry, like, excuse me, you think that you've reached this position, not unlike Chazoni with Yosef thinks he's so special, and he can, he shows his power, but guess what? In the end, you're just like us, and it's a rude awakening. So it's it's never bothered. It hasn't bothered me.
No, I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I think it's fantastic. I have two problems with it. It can be a Mona Lisa and still have a flaw. There could still be a problem here. I see two problems that bother me. Yeah. Yeah, so one point, which I mentioned at the end last time, is when Mordechai says, and who knows, maybe this is why you've become queen. Maybe?
Exactly. It sounds like he's playing her. That should be the only reason she's there.
Yeah. Why doesn't he say, you became queen to do this? You know?
But he believes that God sent her there to be a queen.
Yeah. So say so. Why doesn't he say to her, this is your time? Right? I mean, like every good sports coach rallying the team. Like, this is your time. Why? Maybe it's your time. I don't know. Could be. Like, that's number one. And number two, the other problem is that he says to her, if you don't do this, somebody else will take care of it. Okay. That's good. Then I can go back to enjoy my life as the queen. Why can't... So, okay. Like, if you insist... So it won't be me. It'll be Magilla, somebody else. So
I'm not sure. I think those two are very, 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 strong messages in Jewish, in our Jewish thought. Number one, the Miodea, unless Mordechai has a nevuah, then saying, for example, I think you mentioned it, one of the things is how much you don't like when people will say, COVID came because of this Avera, or we don't know for sure. Like giving a message of, think about it, maybe this is why Hashem put you there, but we don't know for sure.
Right. So that's one approach. I have three to offer, but that was actually the second approach I was going to offer, is to suggest that this reflects the reality of their time. You live at a time when prophecy has largely, if not entirely, disappeared. Right? This is the very end. The beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash is Zechariah and Malachi, and that's it in terms of any publicly known prophets. So Mordechai is legitimately, honestly saying, I don't know, this could be. And that would make Esther, once again, a very strong role model for the period of exile, because she doesn't know what God wants from her. Right? She has to act on her own. I like to make the comparison always between Esther and Rivka, because I think there's a very strong bond between the two. I've mentioned it before, not necessarily in this series. Rivka is told that she's been chosen. I'm just going to mute everybody by default because I'm getting background noise. And if I don't, someone's going to send me a message soon saying, hey, could you please mute everybody? You know who you are. The story with Rivka, right, is that she's minding her own business in Haran, going to the well, getting water, doing the things that she's supposed to do, and suddenly a stranger shows up and has this unbelievable story. You'll never believe it. I was standing at the well. I said to God, send me somebody. This is going to be the one I seek. She's going to offer me water. She's going to offer water to my camels. And look, this woman came and did it. She's the one who's supposed to marry the son of my master. Like, out of nowhere. And she believes it. Because when the decision comes down to her, are you going to go or are you not going to go? She says, Elech, I'm going. Family doesn't want to go. She says, I don't care. I'm going. Right? That's Rivka. And then she has this very difficult pregnancy, doesn't know what's going on, asks God in some way, unclear exactly how, but asks God, what in the world is this? Imkein lama ze anochi? Why'd you pick me in the first place? And the response from God is, Shnei goyim bevitnech, ushnei le'umim me'ayech yiparedu. There are two nations in your womb. There are two nations that are going to separate from you. They're going to fight with each other. One's going to be stronger than the other. And of course, you have to ask the question, there's no comfort in that message to Rivka. Right? The woman says, I don't know what to do. What's wrong with me? I spent 20 years trying to have a child, and this is what it's like. What is this about? And the comforting message is, well, yeah, they're going to fight forever. One of them is going to be bigger than the other one. But don't worry, because the other one will become stronger when he's back. Like, why is that comforting at all? So I really like the idea that I saw years ago that that suggests that the key term in Rivka's message is Shnei Goyim bivitnech, the end of that word, bivitnech. There are two nations in your womb. Shnei le'umim mimei ayech yiparedu. Two nations are going to separate from inside you. In other words, Rivka, you were right all along. This is about you. You are the one who is needed to manage these two. Which is why Rivka has the confidence to say the bracha ought to go to Yaakov, not to Esav. Rivka is incredibly bold. I see Rivka shaking her head, but I want Rivka to take a look on the source sheet at source number 2, at what Ramban says. Ramban is really bothered at this whole business of switching who's getting the bracha. Why does Yitzchak really not understand? And he says something which, when you read the story, is actually pretty logical. Rivka never told Yitzchak about God's message. The message that Rivka got about the two nations and the younger one is going to be greater, Rivka chose never to tell him. Otherwise, Yitzchak would have gone along with it. Yitzchak would not have tried to get the bracha to Esav if he knew that God said the younger one is going to be the greater one. The answer, says Ramban, is Rivka never told him. But wait, Ramban, you stopped too soon. You didn't explain to me. Why didn't Rivka tell him? But the answer is because she understands it's not about Yitzchak. It's about her. She was picked from the time she was living in Haran. God wanted it to be her decision. And no one else can actually make that assessment, and she won't listen to anybody else's assessment. And that, to me, is very much what Mordechai is saying to Esther here. You're the one on the spot. I don't know. But who knows? We don't have, as Jeanette said, we don't have prophecy. We can't know. But you're the one on the spot. It's for you to make this call. So that's one approach to why Mordechai seems so uncertain. Janine. That you can't.
You can't. And I guess when you think about it, if she had not acted, she was stuck as a prisoner in this king's whole household. She was married to Mordechai, according to many opinions. I mean, she's in a horrible position, and she probably would have been lost if she hadn't acted.
So you're anticipating, right? You're anticipating where Chazoni is going. So hold the thought. You're right.
Are you? Is Janine referring to like the Vashti quandary? Is that kind of also like she could be in Vashti's position? Like he could toss her out and get another one.
Right. She could be weaker than the Vashti position even. Vashti, at least has some kind of something. Esther goes back to what? I just wanted, before I get to Chazoni and the idea that Janine is putting out there, I wanted to point out Rashi. Rashi reads it without really reflecting on the uncertainty in Mordechai's words. But take a look at source number 1. He says, Miyodea, Shema lo higat lemalchut ela ba'avur ha'it hazot shetoshii et Yisrael. He says, who knows? Perhaps you only became queen for this purpose of saving the Jewish people. In other words, Rashi says, remember, Rashi thought that the problem here was that she's saying, I can do this later. I'm able to take care of this sometime in the next 11 months. So Rashi says, if you're going to wait a few months to see what happens, you may not be queen anymore by then. Right now, you're in charge, whatever that means for the queen. But who knows if that's going to be true in another 7, 8, 9 months. Don't wait. Rashi's read is that Mordechai is simply saying, I don't know. He doesn't address the uncertainty. But don't gamble on waiting for later because you don't know how that's going to play out. That's the way Rashi reads it. So we have Rashi saying it's act now, don't wait. We have a second idea that I'm putting out there that what Mordechai is trying to say is we really don't know. We don't. But this is all about you, and you have to make this call. Granted that, Hashem will come up with some other way. But now let's do Chazoni. Chazoni suggests that what Mordechai is doing here is he's arguing that she should stop making her being about retaining proximity to Achashverosh. Stop thinking that you have to retain your status in the palace. Use the capital you have, essentially, instead of hoarding it, is the point that Mordechai is trying to make. And you see this in other books of that era, meaning the Sifrei Tanakh that talk about the Babylonian and Persian era give us pictures of Jews living as part of the court. I gave you in source number 3 the 3 parallels. You have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, right, allies of Daniel. In the 3rd parak in Daniel, there's a big announcement. Everybody has to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's big gold statue. When the music plays, they refuse to bow, knowing that they're going to be thrown into the furnace. They refuse anyway. But what about the importance of being part of the court and having influence? Sorry, it doesn't matter. This is what we're supposed to do. Then Daniel, in the 6th chapter in the book, same thing. There's a decree in the time of King Darius that nobody should make any requests of anyone but the king. And Daniel goes up to his room and he davens by his window where everybody can see him, knowing it's going to get him thrown to the lions. Doesn't matter. And then finally, in the beginning of Sefer Nehemiah, right? Some of you learned that with me a few years ago. We did Ezra and Nehemiah. So Nehemiah is the cupbearer for the Persian king, and he asks for permission to go build up the wall of Jerusalem, knowing that could get him into a lot of trouble. Right? A conquering empire doesn't necessarily want former capitals to have walls. Those who try to stop the process of the Jews building up Jerusalem told the king, if you're going to let them build a wall, the next step is that they're going to use their defenses to stop paying taxes to you. They're going to throw off your authority. So there's an element of endangerment, self-endangerment for Nehemiah. The message in all of those stories is, don't put your royal position first. Your emphasis has to be what you do with the capital you've developed. And what Mordechai is doing, says Chazoni, is trying to convey that to Esther, that you can't know what God wants of you. Take a look at source number 4, please, on your sheet, where I retyped some of what Professor Chazoni says. He says, it is this theory of the divine will singling out a single person as the sole possible savior that Mordechai categorically rejects. In contrast to Joseph's self-assurance that the divine plan is manifest and that he is it, Mordechai argues that while one may have a critical role to play in some divine plan, this cannot be known for certain, and that if one proves unwilling or unable to fulfill such a role, it will be played by someone else. So you don't even know what the role is supposed to be, and you could actually lose it while you're trying to hold on to it. In disavowing this theory, Mordechai's first line of attack is a counterintuitive one. He seeks to deflate the importance that the individual in a position of power naturally tends to assign himself, by emphasizing the Jewish belief that the Jewish people is in any case eternal, and the survival of the Jews therefore foregone with or without Esther's help. He ironically renders her free to act. Right? He says to her, it's kind of a twisted argument, right? It's, number one, this may not be about you. But number two, if it is about you and you don't move, then you will have failed. And that brings Chazoni to the point about Esther losing her identity, and this goes back to what Janine was saying, if she doesn't act. Take a look at number 5, please, where Chazoni continues. But the belief in the eternity of Israel, the idea the nation is always going to last, has its problematic aspect as well. For if the relief and deliverance will surely come from elsewhere, then what possible reason can there be for Esther to act at all? Someone else will do it. Mordechai is not just trying to scare her. He is in deadly earnest when he says that she'll be lost. For although the fate of the Jewish people as a whole cannot and should not be understood to be in Esther's hands alone, there is nevertheless a portion whose fate may very well depend on her. If Esther is silent at such a time, then who knows? Perhaps she will have missed the opportunity to save thousands, but one thing is certain, that she herself will be lost, and with her the house of her father. Mordechai's certainty comes from an understanding that the battle of the court Jew is ultimately the struggle to save not the Jewish people, but himself. Right? This is the way that she will be lost. Not lost to the hands of Haman, but lost in the sense that she will be Vashti all over again if she, one way or the other, right? Getting kicked out or remaining. But fundamentally subservient to Achashverosh. So this offers very important lessons to me, going all the way back to the beginning of the book and our point that Esther is a lesson for the Jews living in exile. This is a really important lesson regarding what we do with such influence as we have. If we're not going to speak up, then why do we have the influence in the first place? And what sacrifices will become permanent? The sacrifices that we've made in order to get to that point. Okay. Comments on that before we go a little further in this chapter. Gita. You got to unmute.
You're really saying, or someone else does, that the job description of a court Jew is to save himself and not the people?
I don't think so.
Well, okay, so let me read this again. Understanding the battle of the court Jew is ultimately the struggle to save not the Jewish people, but himself.
Right. So what Chazoni is trying to say here is God is going to take care of the Jews. If the court Jew says, I am not willing to be that savior of the Jews because I want to preserve my position, then he's giving himself up. Or in other words, the reason to spend the capital you've developed is because doing that will save you. So that you don't simply become somebody who's trying to survive within the court.
And the salvation of the Jews would come from God directly.
Maybe through you. Maybe through you. We could really simplify Chazoni's argument by pointing out that it applies to so many other things that come up in the course of life. Right? You think of a person who amasses friendships, but the way they amass friendships is by telling everybody what they want to hear. And doing for everybody exactly what they want. And they're never willing to stand up for themselves. And they're never willing to take a position that might be unpopular. So good, you amassed a lot of friendships. That's great. People like you. But who are you at that point? Right? Or a person who amasses a lot of wealth and they never spend it, they never give it, they never use it. Okay. So what did you accumulate it for? For what? The person who gets power and influence in the royal court, but is never going to use it to help anyone. So, okay, you end up being, a pet of the king. That's what you've accomplished. That's what Mordechai is warning her, according to Chazoni.
But there's no mention of God.
Where?
That's the whole Magilla. That's the whole Magilla.
No, where do you mean in Mordechai's speech? Yeah. No, that's true. He never makes an explicit mention in his in this speech, other than to say there's a sense of destiny. There's a sense of destiny, he says, for the Jews. The Jews are going to be saved somehow. And there's a sense of destiny for you. Maybe this is why you're here. But he doesn't mention God, and we've talked about the question of overall in the Megillah, what's the idea of eliminating God's name? God is in the book in the sense that the Jews are depicted as being religious. When they're in trouble, they fast and they cry out, they pray. The nation is a religious nation. Mordechai's refusal to bow being another example. But no, his speech doesn't say it. So I wanted to know two other things about this. Yeah. Dahlia and then Janine.
Okay. Is this, do you think, a lesson for every court Jew from, Abarbanel to Jared Kushner? I mean, just throughout the ages to Aaron Cutler. Every time, because these have all been court Jews.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's absolutely to be taken that way. absolutely 100%. If Abarbanel had written a commentary to Megillat Esther, this would have been front and center. We don't have a commentary of his on Esther, unfortunately, but totally would have been his message. I think so. Him especially, because he is somebody who, who always took what he saw in Tanakh and applied it to his own experiences in Spain. He put that in his commentaries. So yes, I think so. It's all of us in the positions that we're in, as somebody wrote to me just now. Each of us, it's not only the court Jew. The court Jew happens to be a really good example of it. Okay. And Janine, you were going to say?
I just wanted to say that I was not actually referring to what happened to Vashti. I was thinking that she and her father's house would disappear Jewishly.
Mm-hmm.
She'd become totally assimilated. I don't think it was only a question of life and death.
Yeah.
But even losing her whole heritage.
Right. No, and I think that's what Chazoni means when he talks about that. That's true. Yeah. Right. No, that. Yes. Ellen.
I know it doesn't mention Hashem in anything, but it's interesting that it says Mimako Acher. Usually Mako means Hashem.
Right. So when we start looking for God in the Megillah, we find all sorts of interesting things, right. And you're right, the word Makom is definitely one of them. There are others, but yes, it's true. Okay. 2 other notes on this chapter before we hit the next one. The danger for Esther, the threat to Esther. So normally, when we read this, we read the threat to Esther is Achashverosh kills people if they don't, if they show up inappropriately, right? That's the threat to Esther. That makes sense? Let me ask you a question. If you're Achashverosh and you don't want visitors, what's your solution?
Lock the door and don't let anyone in.
Lock the door, says Susan. You've got guards. You have servants, right? In chapter 6, when Achashverosh can't sleep and Haman is outside in the yard, right? Achashverosh says, Mi bechatzer, who's out in the yard? And they tell him, oh, hine Haman omed bechatzer. He has people at his disposal. You're the king of 127 lands, right? Why aren't there guards to keep people out? Why do you need to issue a death penalty for whoever shows up? Like, just put the guards out there with their swords and spears and whatever else, and be done with it. So, it's just an odd decree. Yeah, Rebecca.
Well, you mentioned last week, this is a man that since the plot has been, I think possibly forever was worried about his position, and since the plot against his life has been more concerned. The question is, if Bigdan of Terror were part of his entourage, which they seem to have been, then who can you trust?
Right. So the answer may be, I need this decree because I can't necessarily trust my guards. Although honestly, then who's going to protect him from whoever does come in the door? But okay. But that's true. It could be the decree. Sorry, what, Toby?
There are also the people who are so close to the king that they can say to the guards, let me in or I'll have your head.
Right. So one possibility is that the decree is for the people who don't listen to the guards. When Esther shows up and says, I'm walking in, the guards aren't really going to stop her, and therefore she's afraid that the decree is going to be carried out against her. That's one possibility. But I'd offer a second possibility here, which is that Esther could get killed even if the guards stop her, just for trying to go in. And I base that on a comment that Professor Yonatan Grossman makes. And I gave you an excerpt from his article in source number 6. The article is called Tochnit Esther, right? Esther's plan. Grossman is pursuing a different point. But in his piece, he highlights 2 ways in which Esther's danger is heightened. Take a look, please. My translation here, the bottom of the first side goes on to the second side. I'm just going to go with my English translation because there's a lot of text here. Naturally, the reader is reminded of Vashti when he meets Esther violating the royal order, raising the tension and anticipation as she is about to meet with the king. At this point, before the eyes of the reader stands a living example of the wife of the king violating his royal order. These are not just threats. The reader wonders if Esther's end will be like that of Vashti. So in other words, she isn't like anybody else who tries to go into the king. If somebody else tries to go see the king and the guards say go away, there's no penalty, you just go away. But if Esther goes in to try to see the king, it's a reenactment of Vashti's rebellion. And therefore, there is greater risk to her. That's number one. Number two, second, Esther's act casts an ironic light upon the law that had been accepted in the kingdom after Vashti's mutiny, right? Remember Achashverosh's decree? There, does it not say, for each man to rule in his home, and the rule of the male was established as a general law which could not be violated? There is not another biblical story in which the plotting of women and the ridicule of the males beside them is so explicit. I like that line. I'm not sure it's true, but I like it. The Magilla specifically, which begins its story with a declaration upon the special status of the man in the family, is that which elevates upon a pole the activity of a woman who brings her husband, the king, against his will and without his knowledge to the place she wishes. In other words, you have a book that starts with all the men are in charge, and then the next chapters are all about how the men are not in charge. How it could be it didn't work out for Vashti, but it sure works out for Esther to get Achashverosh to do what she wants him to do. You could throw in Zeresh and Haman, by the way, in this regard as well. So the point that Grossman makes is that, number one, Esther is reenacting Vashti's rebellion, except it's kind of ersatz, right? Vashti's rebellion is, I won't show up. Esther's response is, I will show up. That's number one. But number two is that Esther is flouting Achashverosh's decree that the man is supposed to be the one in charge. She's going to be the one in charge instead. So I think that's a really interesting point, and it highlights the fact that she could be vulnerable just for trying to go see Achashverosh, even if the guards do stop her. One other note, by the way, which Grossman mentions from Professor Yisrael Rosenson, and I thought it was a very interesting insight. This whole book revolves around lawbreakers. Think about it, right? Vashti does not go to Achashverosh. Mordechai won't bow to Haman. Esther goes to Achashverosh without permission, right? That's what makes this book go. Who's the only law-abiding citizen in Megillat Esther? Where's Moy? She's going to love this.
Not Mordechai?
Is it Haman? No, Mordechai sitting in the...
Yeah, Mordechai won't bow. Haman. Haman is the only law-abiding citizen in Megillat Esther. This is from Professor Yisrael Rosenson. I thought it was a brilliant insight.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
I know you may have said it, but who wrote the book? Because the authorship is excellent. It got you at your end of your seat. Even though I know the story, every year I get involved. Who do we say wrote?
So I'll tell you what we said in the beginning. We talked about the question very briefly, noted the ambiguity within the Megillah itself about who wrote it, and then I told you wait for chapter 9 when we talk about the recording of the book, and we'll have to figure out what we can about the authorship. It is not at all clear.
So we don't know.
I said we don't know now. Maybe by chapter 9 we'll have an answer. We may have more than one answer.
Because I wonder, because all of this, the way we're talking now, there's such a literary technique to this book.
Oh, yeah.
Besides a religious one. Like, leaving all these questions, knowing, I have a feeling the author knew we'd have questions, and yet made it this way so we would be involved.
Yeah.
I think that's quite unique.
It's definitely, I wouldn't say it's the only book like this in Tanakh,
no,
but it's very different from most of the others.
Yeah.
No, that's for sure true. That's for sure true. The other point that I wanted to make at the end of this chapter is Esther's appeal to the nation. When Esther says to Mordechai, all right, here's what we're going to do, right? In Pasuk Tet Zayin, sentence 16. She says, Lech kenos es kol hayudim, gather all the Jews, hanimtzeim b'Shushan, who are found in Shushan, it's a local decree, v'tsumu alai, and fast for me. Don't eat, don't drink, 3 days, fine. Fast for me. This fast is not a fast about the decree. They already had a fast for the decree in the beginning of the chapter, right? In the beginning of the chapter, in sentence 3, in Pasuk Gimel, we were already told what was the line? Eva gadol hayudim v'tzom u'v'chiyu mispaid. They're already fasting, they're already grieving, they're already crying. That was there. This is not that fast. This is a fast for Esther, which, by the way, informs us, and this is obvious probably to all of you, but it never hit me this way before, that all the Jews know who Esther is. Achashverosh may not know she's Jewish, but all the Jews do. Right? This is classic, in terms of the way Jews do things. But yeah, they're all like, yeah, we got the queen. But that's one point that I think emerges here. But Moshe Lichtenstein made a very interesting point in an essay. It was a sikha originally, a speech of sorts, called Megillat Esther v'Hadilemma HaChinuchit. He says, this is where the book becomes Megillat Esther instead of Megillat Mordechai. Someone wrote to me in the chat, Madeleine Albright, but even there, she didn't know she was Jewish. You may have known.
I would ask, why isn't it the
Her
Megillat
first cousins
Hadassah?
were Jewish. Her first cousins were Jewish, but she didn't know she was Jewish.
Right. Sorry, what, Ruchama?
I was always wondering, why isn't it Megillat Hadassah?
Right. Well, Esther is the name that she operates under, that's for sure. But here is where the book becomes Megillat Esther, says Rav Moshe Lichtenstein. He says, if you read this carefully, you realize that Mordechai and Esther are presented as opposite models. In the beginning of the Megillah, right, Achashverosh seems to be a very cosmopolitan and very open ruler. He has this big party and he invites all nations. He sends out scrolls to all the nations in their own language. Right? Everybody in their own tongue. Although he wants the wives to use the language of the husbands. But he sends out his messages to all the nations in all their languages. When he has a party, Vashtiyah Chadat Ein Ones. You drink as much as you want to drink. There's no one being forced to do so. He gives people a lot of latitude in the beginning of the Megillah. And Esther is part of that, right? She's able to become queen, even though she has no political connections. Esther is not anchored. Rav Moshe says something interesting. He says that by Esther not having parents, ein la'av v'em, it means that she is not anchored in a tradition. There isn't anybody, in Mordechai we have, raising her, but she doesn't have those roots that others would have. And then she goes off to live in the palace of this cosmopolitan Achashverosh. And Esther, when there is a decree, reacts in a way that's very different from Mordechai's reaction. Mordechai is wearing sackcloth and ashes. Esther tries to send him fine clothing to wear. Esther is going to go to Achashverosh wearing malchut, wearing royal clothing. The Jews are going to fast. Esther is going to hold parties. Esther, as Rav Moshe presents it, represents a more cosmopolitan side as opposed to Mordechai, who is kind of the more constrained and more traditional approach. So that he points out the Medrash, which I brought you here in source number 7, that has Mordechai gathering school children and having them fast and wearing sackcloth and having them cry. That's Mordechai. But his appeal is specifically for the school children. Whereas Esther appeals to the entire nation. Kol HaYehudim. Esther is there for everybody. And what Rav Moshe contends is that these two roles, the Mordechai role and the Esther role, are seen in the Jewish people throughout time. You have those who take a very narrow type of a position, insulated from society, separate from the greater world, and they're going to wear the sackcloth and ashes, and they're going to cry, and they're going to get the school children together to learn in response to a crisis. And then you have the Esthers, who are much more public, who live a life that is much more open and aware of the world and involved in the world, and they're going to take their own tack in a time of crisis and try to use their influence in the court, as Esther ultimately does. And his argument is that you need both. The Jewish people need the Mordechais, and the Jewish people need the Esthers. And then he makes the point, hang on, Susan, he makes the point that the Mordechais and the Esthers have to work together. And that's what I brought in source number 8 from his essay, reading my translation aloud. He says, we'll not deal right now with the actual choice, meaning the choice between being a Mordechai or being an Esther. From the very fact that I'm presenting this talk in Yeshivat Har Etzion, he says, one may understand which way I have chosen. He's part of the more open group. Also, we will not deal with another question, no less important, which is the question of relationships between these two groups, the Mordechais and Esthers, which must be a relationship of partnership and mutual fructification, and not isolation and estrangement. What is important for me to emphasize is that after the decision for the direction of mixing and joining, of openness and reception, after you choose to be an Esther, we must accept upon ourselves Esther's mission. Wherever we can create ties with our brethren, the Chilonim, whether in the area of education, whether in the army, whether at work, we must recognize the vital necessity of attempting to bring the general community, each according to his ability, to the side of service of God. He says, if you want to be an Esther, and you want to mix in the greater world, you have a responsibility not to say only, this is who I am, but to be an influence in that greater world. That's part of your job. The job of an Esther is not just to sit in the palace, but to influence the course of events. And that's the point that he makes here, is that that's how she's able to appeal to the Jews as a whole, because her approach, being out there in the world, will resonate with them. I thought that was a very interesting sikha. I thought that was an interesting talk of his. Yes, Susan?
When we talk about the miracles, the fact that every Jews knew, and people are gossips, the miracle that it never got back to Haman and never got back to the palace is really a miracle. When you know how many people kept this secret.
It's really startling. And not to mention, but I will, the fact that we've already pointed out, which is, she is taken from Mordechai's house. And Mordechai is identified as Ha-Yehudi. Everybody in this book knows Mordechai is a Yehudi. Achashverosh says to Haman, go get all the royal garb and all that, and put it on Mordechai Ha-Yehudi. Everybody knows he's a Jew. So, this is kind of an event going on in the book that everybody's just ignoring.
Yeah, it's a miracle that it never got back. I mean, you put 3 Jews together, 20 know in 2 minutes.
So that's the thing. This is right. I mean, it depends on your perspective. I'm looking at the book as a believing Jew, and therefore I look at it as a miracle. The other way that you can look at it is say it's a plot hole. Right? It's all in how you perceive it. Dahlia's laughing.
I mean, it's funny, but it's not the way I thought of it.
Yeah.
So I never thought of it before, but it really is a miracle to think that all these Jews knew she was Jewish. And they clearly knew she was Jewish because she calls a fast and they all fast. And it doesn't get back to Haman that she's in danger, and he walks blindly into the meal that she makes for the feast.
Seriously.
Like, how could he not know?
Right. It's really remarkable. I'm telling you, we're going to have such fun at the Purim Suda this year. They keep in mind, Purim this year is a Friday, which means you're likely doing your meal in the morning. On the other hand, with COVID, how much time are you going to spend delivering Mashlach Manot anyway? So you have a nice long meal. That's something to talk about another time.
Starts Thursday.
Okay.
It's a big lockdown.
So let's keep moving here. I haven't heard the announcement yet, but I don't want to. Give me another 15 minutes. So reviewing reviewing Perek Dalet, reviewing chapter 4. Our major theme is the Jew in the royal court, and Chazoni's point about the risk of becoming like what he thinks has happened to Yosef, unlike the explanations that we brought from Rashi, Malbim, and so on, but the idea that you become wedded to this sense of, I need to be in the royal court, and that has to come before everything. And then the lesser points that we made about the danger to Esther, and about Esther being a more sympathetic figure for the nation than Mordechai. Let's move into Perek Hay, chapter 5. So I gave you on the sheet brief outline, right? This chapter is a relatively straightforward chapter. Esther goes to Achashverosh and successfully invites him to come to a party with Haman. They have a first party. Achashverosh says, "No, what's on your mind, Esther?" Esther says, "Actually, I'd like you to come to a second party. And at that party, I'll tell you what's on my mind." And Haman leaves the party, and he's just thrilled. I'm on top of the world. I was invited to this party. Everything is wonderful until he sees Mordechai, and Mordechai doesn't budge. Mordechai doesn't look afraid of him. Not a thing. And Haman is furious, and he says, "I'm not willing to wait for the 13th day of Adar. I want to do something with Mordechai." He consults his family, and his family comes up with the bright idea of making a 50 amma tall gallows, right? And, I think people read that and don't really think about what that means. 50 amot is roughly, you're talking 80 feet. Roughly 80 feet. An 80-foot tall gallows. Like, you didn't need it to be that tall. So that's one of the questions we're going to have to discuss. But the main questions we're going to have to figure out here are, why does Esther invite Haman to the party? And we all have our ideas on this. This is something that everybody discusses. Nonetheless, I do think that we might be able to break some new ground with this. And also a popular question, why doesn't Esther make her sales pitch at the first party? Why does she need a second party? So those are the main questions that I'd like to look at. There are some other things that we're going to have to talk about, but those are the main ones that I'd like to look at. The major theme, or one of the major themes, I shouldn't say that. One of the major themes in this chapter is divine control. The idea that everything that happens in this story is going to fit a plan, and is going to fit a clear structure. Another major theme in this chapter is going to be how Jews in exile deal with their enemies. But right now we're going to deal with the divine structure, divine control, and the structure that you see. And again, as Joyce noted, we're not going to get God named. But you're going to see an incredible structure to what goes on in this Magilla. So, first of all, in general, you can follow the arc of Haman's career and recognize in it a theme that's found throughout Tanakh, which is the bad guys get elevated, they reach the height, and then they come crashing down. That's a commonplace in Tanakh. Probably the best example of someone pointing that out in Tanakh is whom? Who points this out in Tanakh? There's a person who wrote a poem in Tanakh. A song, you might say.
Oh, Hannah.
Hannah, right? That is Shirat Hannah. That is Hannah's song. She says explicitly, she talks about Hashem, Hannah's Shira, which I didn't put it on the sheet, but it's Shmuel Aleph, in Perek Bet in chapter 2, it's Haftarah and Rosh Hashanah, is all about how God manipulates things to bring the arrogant low and to elevate those who had been low, so that they are now above. You find in Tehillim a lot. You find David using it, building on the ideas of Shirat Hannah, especially in the chapters of Hallel. You find it in Daniel, demonstrated in the arc of Nebuchadnezzar, who is brought low after achieving his great heights. The Malbim makes this point. If you take a look at source number 9, I didn't bring you the translation on the sheet. The sheet is nice and neat, fits into 2 sides of 1 page. But I brought you the Hebrew, and we'll read it now. He says, this is Malbim commenting. Actually, we should see the pasuk he's commenting on first. Chapter 5, sentence 9. This is when Haman leaves the party. I'll do that muting here. Okay. Chapter 5, sentence 9. Haman leaves Esther's first party. Sorry, not number 9. Oh, yeah, it is number 9. I'm just in the wrong chapter. Don't mind me. Let's try that again. Vayetze Haman bayom hahu sameach v'tov lev. It's a verse you could read 100 times and never catch the words that Malbim catches, because no one has an ear like the Malbim. Right? Malbim has an ear like those who were long before him. In those words, Vayetze Haman bayom hahu sameach v'tov lev, and Haman left on that day, happy and of good heart. The key words that Malbim picks up on are the words bayom hahu. Haman left on that day, happy and of good heart. Says Malbim, Haman is hard to please. This is the first time that the guy cracks a smile. Take a look at source number 9 now. Misaper ginut harasha hazeh v'roat chunato. It presents here, it tells us here about the disgrace of this wicked person, about his bad character. Sha'ad ata, until now, b'chol ha'ma'alot asher Allah, with all of the levels he ascended, lo samach miyamav, he's never been happy. Ki chol ma'ala she'isig haya mevakesh masha achareha. Every time he achieves something, he says, okay, fine, what's next? What else can I get? V'haita ma'ala kodemek tana beinav, whatever he already achieved seemed like nothing to him. Rak hayom hahu, only that day, shigia l'ktei ha'gedula v'ha'kavod, when he achieved, an extreme of greatness, of honor, liot shaveh im hamelech, to be equal to the king. Az haya hayom harishon sheyatza sameach v'tov lev. That's the first time Haman is in a good mood. At last, Haman is in a good mood. He became Mishneh LaMelech, second to the king. Nah, there are other things I want. He gets whatever he gets. He wants something more. And Rav David Sabato spells this out very well. I just gave you bullet points. It's right below number 9 on your sheet. I forgot to put in the line number. It should say 10. Okay. Rabbi David Sabato is still the 10th source on the sheet, in which he spells out all the things that Haman achieved. Right? First, he became Mishneh LaMelech, second to the king. Then everybody bows to him, we're told, other than Mordechai. Then he can issue a decree using Tabat HaMelech, the king's ring. The king hands him the ring. And not only that, he has the power to destroy a nation. Then the queen invites him to a party with the king. Only ones invited, Haman and Achashverosh. And finally, we didn't see it yet, but we will, the king is going to say to him, what should I do for the one Asher HaMelech Chafetz Bikaro? What should I do for the one I want to honor? He keeps on climbing. The last step hasn't happened at this stage. But Haman keeps on getting what he wants, and then it all comes crashing down. But what I think demonstrates that this is something that's being controlled, that it's something that's not random, is the way that this occurs in pairs. And I highlighted it for you on the sheet with some examples. Key events in the Magilla happen in pairs. But the first time is when the Jews are in trouble and Haman is doing well. And the second time is when the Jews are on the rise and Haman comes crashing down. It's a neat structure. Esther comes to Achashverosh twice. The first time she goes to Achashverosh, she is a supplicant, right? She needs something. The second time she goes to Achashverosh, she's now in power. Anyone here know how to lane the Magilla? Okay, we've got one at least. 2? Okay. So the following thing is always challenging when you lane the Magilla. Vayoshet hamelech laEsther et sharvit hazahav asher biyado is one of several examples in the Magilla of words that appear multiple times, but they have different trup. They have different notes when they appear. So as a Baal Kriya, you're looking at it and trying to think, how am I going to remember that the notes are different? Well, the notes for Vayoshet HaMelech LaEsther et Shavit HaZahav, the first time, are very excited. Kadma v'Yazla. Vayoshet HaMelech LaEsther. Right? Vayoshet HaMelech, we're very excited. The second time, it's Mabach Pashta. Vayoshet HaMelech, ... There's excitement the first time. She is somebody who's been saved from trouble by the king doing this. The second time, it's routine. She goes into the king. Because the second time, she's in power. The first time, she's a supplicant. Esther's parties. The first party, great source of joy for Haman. Sameach v'tov leiv. Oh, is he thrilled. The second party destroys him. The family meetings of Haman. The first family meeting, he tells them all about how he's got so much wealth and he's got such a large family and they're in power and we're going to destroy Mordechai. The second time round, they tell him, actually, if you started to lose to Mordechai, yeah, it's basically over. Right? And of course, the first time, who is he meeting with? Zeresh Ishto V'chol Ohavav. He meets with Zeresh and all those who love him. And the second time he has the family meeting, it's Zeresh Ishto V'chol Chachamav. It's Zeresh and all of the wise people. The emotional relationship isn't there for some reason. And Haman's meetings with Achashverosh. Haman comes to Achashverosh in the 3rd chapter, and the result is a decree against the Jews. Haman meets with Achashverosh in the 6th chapter, and the result is parading Mordechai around the city. Right? So what I'm trying to show you here is a definite structure where the Megillah presents us events in pairs. When the event happens and Haman is on the rise, like Rabbi Sabato pointed out, climbing from step to step to step, nothing can go wrong. All of these things help Haman. However, once Haman begins to fall, and the pivot point, as Rabbi Sabato points out for Haman, is parading Mordechai around the city. Once Haman's decline begins, the same things that worked in his favor the first time are now poison. Meeting Achashverosh is a bad thing for him. Consulting with his family results in disaster. Esther's parties drag him down instead of elevating him. What we're seeing is the same event can happen twice, and the first time it can be positive, and the second time it can be destructive, and it's all just about where you are within the divine plan. That's what the Megillah is showing. Clear? Okay. Comments on that? It's 2:28, so I'm hesitant to start something. Maybe I'll start a question, at any rate, unless someone has a question, unless someone has something. Okay, so let's...
I have one question.
Yes, Susan, go ahead.
Where else does this appear, or does it not appear elsewhere? Like, do we have this parallel business that gives us all these warnings elsewhere in Tanakh?
So you do have parallels. I actually mentioned it last Thursday in the Shmuel Shir with Shaul. Right? We saw there that Shaul has events which take place twice for him, and the first time they're positive, and the second time they're negative. I didn't buy into the whole presentation when I presented it, and that may be why it didn't come across as clearly. I'm not sure that all the examples really fit. But we saw, for example, how Shaul has 2 encounters with Yavesh Gilad, right? The first time when he saves them from Ammon, and the second time when they're burying his body from the Plishtim. He has the beginning, his first meeting with Shmuel, right, when he's on the rise and things are positive, and then the last time he meets with Shmuel, where Shmuel's already dead, where it's predicted that he's going to die as well. The first time they say, Hagam Shaul Banaviim, is Shaul really a prophet when he prophesies in the beginning of his career, versus the second time, Hagam Shaul Banaviim, when he goes to David. And at that point, it's decidedly the downside for him. It's when all his men are becoming loyal to David. So we see those kinds of structures elsewhere as well. That does happen. Okay. So thank you very much then, and God willing, next week we will continue in chapter 5 and even venture into chapter 6, God willing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great share. Thank you.
Great share. Great share.
Be well.